Welcome. Tonight we're going to slow down. The world outside is moving at a million miles an hour, but in here, time is standing still. We are going to talk about a man named Caleb. Caleb was 42 years old, living in a small house in the suburbs of Virginia. He worked in finance, staring at numbers on a screen all day until his eyes burned. He felt like he was running a race with no finish line. He had the house, he had the car, but he felt empty. He felt like he was a character in a book that someone else was writing. One rainy Saturday, while cleaning out his late father's attic, Caleb found a heavy iron chest. Inside, wrapped in an old flannel shirt, was a golden pocket watch. It didn't tick, it didn't move, but tucked behind the watch was a letter addressed to him. 010-030, the letter from Thomas. The letter was from his great-grandfather, Thomas. Thomas was a man who lived through the Great Depression, a man who had built houses with his bare hands. The letter read, "My grandson Caleb, if you are reading this, you are likely looking for something. Not something you can buy, but something you've lost. This watch doesn't tell the time of the world, it tells the time of the soul. It stopped the day I realized that I was spending my life building things that wouldn't last. I'm sending you on a journey, Caleb, not across the world, but across the stories of our family. Go to the old cabin in the mountains. Find the man they call Old Man Elias. He holds the key to the watch." Caleb sat there, the rain drumming on the roof above him. He had a meeting on Monday. He had bills to pay. But for the first time in 20 years, he chose the mystery over the routine. He packed a bag, grabbed the watch, and drove toward the mountains. 030-050, the encounter with Old Man Elias. After hours of driving through winding roads lined with oak and pine, Caleb reached a cabin that looked like it was growing out of the earth itself. On the porch sat a man with silver hair and skin like weathered leather. This was Elias. "I've been expecting you, Caleb," Elias said, not even looking up from the piece of wood he was whittling. "How did you know I was coming?" Caleb asked, breathless. "Because your grandfather told me that one day, a man with a heavy heart and a gold watch would show up looking for a battery. But this watch doesn't need a battery, son. It needs a purpose. You can't just grab them. You have to wait for the season to change. Now sit. Let me tell you about a man named Samuel who lived in these mountains in 1910. Samuel was the most ambitious man in the county. Samuel wanted to own the whole valley. He worked from before sunrise until long after the stars came out. He ignored his neighbors. He ignored the Sabbath. He ignored the way his children's voices sounded when they laughed. One day Samuel found a gold mine. He was the richest man for 50 miles, but a strange thing happened. The more gold he put in his pockets, the heavier his legs felt. Soon, he couldn't walk to the top of the hill to see the sunset. He was trapped by his own weight. Elias looked at Caleb. "You see, Caleb, wealth isn't what you gather. It's what you can carry without getting tired." Samuel had everything, but he couldn't carry a single ounce of peace. Caleb looked at the silent watch in his hand. He began to understand. This journey wasn't about the watch. It was about unlearning the life he had built. Elias didn't give Caleb a chair. He gave him a pair of work gloves and a heavy crowbar. They stood at the edge of the property where an old cedar fence had surrendered to the elements. The wood was gray and brittle, collapsing into the tall grass. "You want to know why the watch stopped, Caleb?" Elias asked, leaning on his shovel. "It's because you stopped maintaining the boundaries of your life. When the fence goes down, the wolves get in, and the wolves of worry have been eating your peace for a long time." Caleb didn't argue. He gripped the crowbar and began to pull the rusted nails from the posts. The physical work felt strange to him. His hands were used to keyboards, not splinters. But as he worked, the constant hum of anxiety in his chest began to quiet down. He was focusing on one nail, one post, 1 inch of earth at a time. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the pine trees, Elias began to speak again. His voice was a low rumble that seemed to blend with the wind. "Let me tell you about Sarah," Elias began. "She lived 2 valleys over back in the late 1930s. Those were the lean years, the Great Depression. People were hungry, and hearts were becoming as dry as the soil. Sarah was a widow. She had a small plot of land and 3 children. Every morning she would bake 2 loaves of bread, not 1, 2. Everyone in the village knew she barely had enough flour for her own kids, yet she kept this ritual. One day a traveler came through. He was a man who had lost everything in the city, his business, his pride, his hope. He saw the smoke from Sarah's chimney and knocked on the door. He didn't ask for food, he asked for a map. He wanted to know the quickest way out of the mountains because he thought there was nothing left for him there. Caleb paused his work, listening intently. "Sarah didn't give him a map," Elias continued. "She gave him the second loaf of bread. It was still warm. She told him, 'The map will tell you where you are, but this bread will tell you who you are.'" The man was confused. He asked her, "Why are you giving this to me? I can see your children have patches on their clothes. You should keep this." Sarah looked him in the eye and said something that changed that man's life forever. She said, "My children are fed by what we eat, but their souls are fed by what we give. If I stop giving, we all starve, even with full stomachs." Caleb stopped hammering. She was choosing to be poor so she could be kind. Elias shook his head. "No, Caleb, she was choosing to be rich in the only currency that God counts. You see, the man stayed. He didn't leave the mountains. He used the strength from that bread to help Sarah fix her roof. Then he helped the neighbor fix his barn. Within a year, that single loaf of bread had turned into a community that looked out for one another. That's what we call a blessing that grows. In the old tradition, they called it baraka. It's the idea that a little bit of something, when shared with a pure heart, becomes more than enough. You've been trying to fill your life by adding things to it, Caleb. More money, more status, more stuff. But Sarah knew the secret. You fill a vessel by pouring it out. If the water stays still, it turns sour. If it flows, it stays sweet. By the end of the hour, Caleb had cleared the first 20 feet of the fence line. His back ached and his hands were sore, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He looked at the golden watch sitting on a nearby stump. It still wasn't moving, but for the first time, Caleb wasn't frustrated by the silence. "All right," Elias said, wiping his brow. "The sun is high. Let's head back to the porch. There's someone you need to meet. A young man who thinks he's found a shortcut to the top of the mountain." The afternoon sun began to dip, painting the peaks in shades of burnt orange and deep violet. Caleb and Elias were back on the porch, sipping cold water from tin mugs. The silence was comfortable, the kind of silence you only find far away from the buzz of electricity. Suddenly, the silence was broken. Clag, clag, clag. A young man appeared from the trailhead. He looked like he had stepped straight out of a high-end outdoor magazine. Brand new neon blue jacket, a smartwatch on each wrist, and a GoPro strapped to his chest. He was breathing hard, checking his watch every few seconds. "Hey there," the young man called out, not stopping. "Is this the fastest way to the Eagle's Nest summit? My GPS says there's a trail behind this cabin, but it looks overgrown. I'm trying to catch the sunset for my live stream." Elias didn't stand up. He just pointed a weathered finger toward the long, winding path that hugged the base of the cliff. "That's the way, son, but it'll take you 3 hours. You won't make the sunset if you start now." The young man, whose name was David, stopped. He looked frustrated. 3 hours? There's gotta be a shortcut. I saw a ravine back there. If I scramble up the rocks, I can be there in 40 minutes. I've got the gear. I'm on a schedule. Caleb watched David. He saw himself in that boy. He saw the same frantic energy he used to bring to his boardroom meetings, the obsession with the fastest route, the optimized result. "Why the rush, David?" Caleb asked quietly. David looked at him, surprised. "Efficiency, man. Why spend 3 hours walking when I can do it in 40 minutes? Time is money, right?" Elias let out a soft chuckle. "Time isn't money, David. Money is something you can make more of. Time is something you only spend. And when you take a shortcut on a mountain, you aren't saving time, you're stealing it from your own experience." David rolled his eyes. "Look, I just want the view from the top, that's the goal." "Sit down for 5 minutes," Elias said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command that carried the weight of the mountain itself. David, despite his hurry, found himself sitting on the edge of the porch steps. "Let me tell you about Marcus," Elias began. Marcus was a runner. He was the fastest man in this county 30 years ago. He treated these mountains like a gym. He didn't see the trees, he only saw his heart rate monitor. One day, Elias continued, Marcus decided he was going to break the record for the summit. He took the shortcut ravine, the same one you're looking at, David. He scrambled, he climbed, he pushed his body to the absolute limit. He reached the top in record time. He stood there, panting, drenched in sweat, looking at his stopwatch. He had won, but when he looked around, he realized he didn't remember a single thing about the climb. He didn't see the rare mountain orchids that only bloom in the shade of the cliffs. He didn't hear the song of the hermit thrush. He didn't even notice that he had dropped his father's old compass somewhere halfway up. On his way down, taking the long, slow path because his legs were shaking, he ran into an old woman. She was sitting by a small, hidden spring that Marcus had run past an hour earlier. She was holding his compass. She told him, "You dropped this because you were moving faster than your soul could keep up with. You reached the top, Marcus, but you left the best parts of yourself at the bottom." Marcus realized that day that a view is just a picture, but a journey is a transformation. He spent the rest of his life walking the long paths because he realized that the summit is just a point, but the path is where the life happens. David was quiet for a long time. He looked at his smartwatches, then at the overgrown ravine, and finally at the long, winding trail Elias had pointed out. I think, David said slowly, I might have missed a lot of orchids lately. He stood up, adjusted his pack, and started walking, not toward the ravine but toward the long path. He wasn't running anymore. Caleb watched him disappear into the trees. He felt the golden watch in his pocket. He pulled it out. It was still silent, but the gold felt warmer in his palm. He'll get there, Elias whispered, and more importantly, he'll be there when he arrives. Caleb nodded. I think I'm starting to understand, Elias. My whole life has been a shortcut. I've been trying to get to the end of everything, the end of the workday, the end of the week, the end of the year. Precisely, Elias said, and the end of life is a destination we should be in no hurry to reach. Now, let's get some wood for the fire. Tonight, we talk about the shadows. The darkness of the mountains is different from the darkness of the city. In the city, the night is just a dimmed version of the day, but here, the night is an entity. It is vast, silent, and heavy. Caleb and Elias sat by the stone hearth inside the cabin. The fire cast flickering orange shadows against the timber walls. Outside, the wind began to pick up, a low, mournful whistle through the eaves. Caleb kept checking his phone. No signal. He looked at the golden watch on the mantelpiece. It was still frozen at 12:00. You're packing with your eyes, Caleb, Elias said, poking the embers with a blackened iron rod. The storm is coming, Caleb replied, his voice tight. I saw the clouds earlier. If the road gets washed out, I'm stuck here. I have a conference call on Monday. I have people depending on me. I need to be in control of my schedule. Elias looked up, the fire reflecting in his eyes. Control, that's a heavy coat to wear, son. No wonder your shoulders are always up to your ears. You think you're the one steering the ship, don't you? Caleb sat down, sighing. If I'm not steering, then who is? If I don't worry, things don't get done. That's how I've succeeded. You've survived, Caleb, but you haven't succeeded at being at peace, Elias countered. Worry is like a rocking chair. It gives you something to do, but it doesn't get you anywhere. It's an insult to the one who manages the orbits of the planets. Do you think the stars are worried about where they'll be tomorrow? Caleb looked at the fire. It's easy for a star. They don't have mortgages. Elias laughed softly. True, but they have a creator, and so do you. Let me tell you about a man I knew long ago, a man named Captain Miller. He spent 40 years on the Atlantic. He saw waves that would make these mountains look like pebbles. It was the winter of 1952, Elias began. Captain Miller was commanding a small cargo ship off the coast of Maine. A northeaster hit, a storm so violent the compasses were spinning and the visibility was zero. The crew was panicking. They wanted to turn back, but the rocks were behind them. They wanted to go forward, but the heart of the storm was ahead. Miller was an old-school sailor. He didn't scream and he didn't scramble. He walked to the center of the deck, felt the tilt of the ship, and gave a strange order. He said, drop the secondary anchor, kill the engines, and go below deck to pray. The first mate thought he'd lost his mind. Captain, we have to fight the waves, we have to steer. Miller looked at him and said, son, the ocean is 5 miles deep and the wind is 80 miles an hour. You can't steer against the hand of God. If you try to fight these waves, the hull will snap. But if we drop the anchor and let the ship ride the swells, we might just see the morning. They spent 12 hours in the dark, the ship tossed like a toy. They couldn't see the stars, they couldn't see the shore. They had to rely entirely on the strength of a chain they couldn't see, attached to an anchor they couldn't see, on a seabed they couldn't see. When the sun rose, the sea was like glass. They hadn't moved an inch from where they dropped that anchor. They survived not because they were stronger than the storm, but because they knew when to stop fighting and start trusting. Elias leaned toward Caleb. Your life is that ship, Caleb, and your control is a broken rudder. You're exhausted because you're trying to muscle your way through a storm that you didn't create and you can't stop. The watch in your pocket stopped because you're living in the what if, but the anchor is the what is. You are here, you are safe, you are fed, the rest belongs to the Almighty. Tonight, Caleb, I want you to do what Captain Miller did. Kill the engines, drop the anchor, let the storm happen outside. In here, we're going to find the silence. True strength is not found in the power to change your circumstances, but in the power to remain still while the circumstances change around you. This is the essence of Tawakkul. You do your part by dropping the anchor of hard work and good character, and then you leave the results to the one who knows the end from the beginning. The first mate thought he'd lost his mind. Captain, we have to fight the waves, we have to steer. Miller looked at him and said, son, the ocean is 5 miles deep and the wind is 80 miles an hour. You can't steer against the hand of God. If you try to fight these waves, the hull will snap. But if we drop the anchor and let the ship ride the swells, we might just see the morning. They spent 12 hours in the dark, the ship tossed like a toy. They couldn't see the stars, they couldn't see the shore. They had to rely entirely on the strength of a chain they couldn't see, attached to an anchor they couldn't see, on a seabed they couldn't see. When the sun rose, the sea was like glass. They hadn't moved an inch from where they dropped that anchor. They survived not because they were stronger than the storm, but because they knew when to stop fighting and start trusting. Elias leaned toward Caleb. Your life is that ship, Caleb, and your control is a broken rudder. You're exhausted because you're trying to muscle your way through a storm that you didn't create and you can't stop. The watch in your pocket stopped because you're living in the what if, but the anchor is the what is. You are here, you are safe, you are fed, the rest belongs to the Almighty. Tonight, Caleb, I want you to do what Captain Miller did. Kill the engines, drop the anchor, let the storm happen outside. In here, we're going to find the silence. True strength is not found in the power to change your circumstances, but in the power to remain still while the circumstances change around you. This is the essence of Tawakkul. You do your part by dropping the anchor of hard work and good character, and then you leave the results to the one who knows the end from the beginning. Anna told me once with tears in her eyes, Elias, these trees are more human than we are. They don't hoard, they don't build fences. They know that the health of the individual depends on the health of the whole. Caleb stopped and leaned his hand against the rough bark of an ancient oak. He felt a strange sense of humility. So, Caleb said, even when we think we're alone, we're part of a system. Exactly, Elias replied. The Creator didn't make anything in isolation. Every leaf, every bug, every human being is tied to another by a thread of purpose. When you feel lonely in your life back home, Caleb, it's because you've forgotten the network. You've been trying to be a mother tree without feeding the saplings. You've been trying to grow tall without checking on the roots. Caleb looked down at his boots, then back at the golden watch in his pocket. He realized that the watch had been a hoarded item, a symbol of his family's past that he was keeping for himself, rather than sharing the wisdom it represented. The forest is a mirror, Caleb, Elias said as they turned back toward the cabin. It shows us that true strength isn't about standing alone against the storm. It's about being so connected to others that the storm can't move any of you. Never believe the lie that you are a self-made man or woman. You are a product of the prayers of your ancestors, the kindness of strangers, and the mercy of your Creator. Like the trees of the forest, your purpose is not just to reach for the sun, but to reach out to those in the shade. When you help another person grow, you strengthen the ground you both stand on. The afternoon heat settled over the mountain like a thick wool blanket. Caleb and Elias sat on the cabin's back porch, cleaning out some old drawers from a tool chest Elias had kept for decades. In the bottom of a cedar box, Caleb found a brass compass. It was beautiful, but as Caleb moved it around, he noticed something strange. The needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning lazily, occasionally twitching toward the west, then sticking toward the south. This thing is broken, Elias, Caleb said, tapping the glass. It's completely lost. Elias didn't even look up from his task. The compass isn't broken, Caleb. The needle is still doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's responding to the strongest magnetic force in its immediate environment. The problem isn't the needle. The problem is what's sitting next to it. Caleb looked closer. Tucked in the corner of the box, right next to the compass, was a heavy, magnetized iron file. As soon as Caleb moved the file away, the needle shuddered and swung decisively toward the north. Caleb stared at the needle, so the interference was the problem. Exactly, Elias said. Most people think they are lost because they lack a direction. But the truth is, everyone has a compass in their heart. It's called the fitra, the natural inclination toward what is true and good. But we spend our lives surrounding our hearts with magnets. We surround ourselves with the metal of greed, the iron of pride, and the magnets of other people's opinions. And then we wonder why we feel so confused, why we feel like we're spinning in circles. You don't need a new compass, Caleb. You need to clear out the junk that's pulling your needle the wrong way. Caleb leaned back. How do you even know when you're being pulled? Sometimes I think I'm doing the right thing, and then 6 months later, I realize I was 1,000 miles off course. Elias nodded. It happens to the best of us. Let me tell you about Leo. Leo was a merchant sailor back in the 1920s, Elias began. He was known for being the best navigator on the East Coast. He was meticulous. He checked his maps every hour. But Leo had one flaw. He was incredibly proud of his intuition. One night on a voyage from New York to Bermuda, Leo's compass started acting slightly off, only a few degrees. A humble man would have checked his instruments or looked at the stars. But Leo said, I know these waters like the back of my hand. My gut is more accurate than this brass toy. He ignored the needle. He followed his feeling. He was so focused on being right that he didn't notice the water changing color or the smell of the air shifting. By sunrise, the ship wasn't in Bermuda. It was heading straight for a cluster of jagged rocks off the coast of a completely different island. They almost lost the ship. When they finally docked, Leo opened his navigation kit. He found a small, magnetic key his son had tucked into his pocket as a good luck charm. That tiny key, that good luck charm, had slowly pulled his ship off course for 3 days. Leo realized that his intuition wasn't wrong. His environment was compromised. He had allowed something small and lucky to replace the truth of his instruments. Caleb looked at the brass compass in his hand. It was now pointing north with perfect stillness. Leo spent the rest of his life teaching young sailors that the most important part of navigation isn't the steering, Elias said. It's the clining. You have to keep your station clean of magnets. In life, Caleb, we call this tauba. People think that means apologizing, but it really means returning. It means identifying the magnetic keys in your life, the habits, the egos, the toxic distractions, and moving them away so you can see where you're actually supposed to be going. Caleb realized his magnetic key was his need for validation. Every decision he made was pulled toward what will people think, or will this make me look successful? It's time to clear the deck, Caleb, Elias said. The sun is moving. We've got a long walk ahead before dinner. Do not be afraid to admit you were headed the wrong way. The greatest navigator is not the one who never gets lost, but the one who is humble enough to check the stars when the compass starts to spin. Repentance is not a sign of weakness. It is the ultimate act of courage. It is the moment you decide that the truth is more important than your pride. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch like long fingers across the valley, Elias led Caleb to an old weathered barn at the edge of the clearing. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of aged cedar and raw wool. In the center of the room stood a massive, ancient weaving loom, its wooden frame polished dark by decades of use. Caleb walked around it, touching the hundreds of threads hanging from the beams. Does this thing still work? It never stopped, Elias said, sitting on the bench. He ran his fingers over a section of the fabric currently being woven. From Caleb's perspective, it looked like a mess. There were loose ends, knots of dark charcoal gray, and jagged lines of dull brown. It's not very pretty, Elias, Caleb remarked. It looks chaotic, there's no symmetry. Elias smiled, his eyes twinkling in the dim light. That's because you're looking at it from the back, Caleb. You're looking at the side where the knots are tied and the threads are cut. You're looking at the work side, but the weaver sees the other side. Elias stood up and motioned for Caleb to crawl underneath the frame to look at the fabric from the front. Caleb knelt down and looked up, his breath caught. From this side, the charcoal gray wasn't a mess. It was the shadow of a magnificent mountain. The dull brown was the rich earth of a valley, and woven through it all were tiny, shimmering threads of gold that Caleb hadn't even noticed from the back. It was a masterpiece of a landscape. Life is exactly like this loom, Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. When we are in the middle of our lives, we only see the back of the tapestry. We see the dark threads, the loss of a job, the passing of a loved one, the heartbreak, the failures. We see the knots and we ask, why is my life so messy? Why is there so much gray? But we forget that without the gray threads, there would be no shadow. And without the shadow, the gold threads wouldn't shine. Every knot is a choice, and every cut is a new beginning. Let me tell you about Eliza. Eliza lived in this valley during the Great War, Elias began. She was a master weaver, known for the most vibrant colors in the state, but a fever took her sight when she was only 30. People thought her life was over. They said, what is a weaver who cannot see the colors? For a year, Eliza sat in silence, but then she returned to her loom. She realized that while she couldn't see the colors with her eyes, she could feel the weight and texture of the different dyed wools. The red wool felt warm and slightly coarse. The blue wool felt cool and smooth. She began to weave in the dark. She would spend months on a single piece, her hands moving like spiders across the threads. She couldn't see the pattern she was making. She had to trust the map in her mind and the rhythm of the loom. When she finished her first piece after losing her sight, she invited the village to see it. When they entered the barn, they fell silent. It was a tapestry of a sunrise over the mountains, more beautiful than anything she had made when she could see. Someone asked her, Eliza, how did you know where to put the gold? How did you know the pattern was right? She replied, I didn't need to see the pattern. I just had to be faithful to the thread in my hand at that moment. I trusted that if I followed the laws of the loom, the beauty would take care of itself. Caleb stood up, brushing the dust from his knees. He looked at the loom with a new kind of reverence. So, Caleb said, the dark parts of my life, the divorce, the stress, the feeling of being a failure, those are just threads. They are essential threads, Elias corrected. If your life was all gold and white, you wouldn't be a person, you'd be a blank page. The creator is the weaver, Caleb. He sees the front of the tapestry. He knows exactly why he's using the charcoal thread right now. Your job isn't to understand the whole pattern. Your job is to be faithful to the thread you've been given today. Caleb reached into his pocket and touched the golden watch. He realized that the stopped watch was just a knot in his tapestry, a place where the weaver was starting a new color. The advice to be integrated into the final hour. Do not judge your life by the side you see today. You are currently looking at the knots, the loose ends, and the dark colors. Have patience with the weaver. One day, when the work is finished and the tapestry is turned over, you will see that the moments you thought were mistakes were actually the shadows that gave your soul its depth. Trust the process, even when the pattern makes no sense. The sun had finally dipped below the ridge, leaving the sky a bruised purple. Caleb and Elias walked to the back of the property, where an old stone well stood beneath a massive weeping willow. The air was still, and the only sound was the occasional glug of water settling in the depths. Elias picked up a small pebble from the ground. "Listen," he said, and he dropped it into the dark opening. A second passed, then two, then plink. A tiny sound, followed by a series of echoes that seemed to vibrate through the stones of the well. "That pebble is gone, Caleb," Elias said. "You'll never see it again. It's at the bottom of 50 feet of water, but the well knows it's there." The water level rose, even if just by a microscopic amount. The ripples hit every side of the stone. Every action we take is that pebble. Caleb looked down into the darkness. "I think that's what scares me most, Elias. I've spent 20 years in an office. I've sent a million emails. I've moved numbers from one column to another. But if I dropped my life into a well today, would it even make a sound? Would anyone notice?" Elias leaned against the stone wall. "You're thinking about legacy like it's a monument or a statue in a park. You think you have to be the king to matter. But the most powerful ripples in history didn't come from kings. They came from people who were invisible to the world but indispensable to a single soul. The prophet, peace be upon him, taught us that when a person passes, their deeds stop except for three things: a continuous charity, knowledge that benefits others, or a righteous child who prays for them. None of those require you to be famous, Caleb. They only require you to be present. Let me tell you about Mr. Henderson." Mr. Henderson was a high school math teacher in a town so small it didn't even have a stoplight, Elias began. He taught for 42 years in the same room with the same chalkboard. He never wrote a book. He never won an award. He lived in a house full of books and tea. Most people thought he was a failure by modern standards. He had the same salary for decades. But Mr. Henderson had a habit. Every year he would find the one student who was the most broken, the one everyone else had given up on. In 1974, that student was a boy named Henry. Henry's father was gone, his clothes were ragged, and he sat in the back of the class with a hoodie pulled over his face. He was failing every subject. Mr. Henderson didn't lecture him, he just asked Henry to help him calibrate the school's old telescope after class. For 6 months they sat on the roof of the school. They didn't talk much about math, they talked about the stars. Henderson told him, "Henry, the stars don't care about your grades, they only care that you're looking at them." Henry eventually graduated. He went into the military, then to college on the GI Bill. He became a heart surgeon. Over a 30-year career, Henry saved over 5,000 lives. 5,000 families stayed whole because of Henry's hands. When Mr. Henderson passed away, there were no cameras, no newspapers, just a small funeral. But at the back of the room stood Henry, and behind him were dozens of people whose lives Henry had saved. They didn't know Mr. Henderson's name, but they were breathing because of a man who sat on a roof in 1974 and told a lonely boy that he mattered. Elias looked at Caleb. Mr. Henderson was the pebble, Henry was the ripple, and those 5,000 families, they are the echo. You don't need to change the whole world, Caleb. You just need to change the world for one person. That is the only legacy that survives the grave. Your emails and columns of numbers are just dust. But the way you treat the person who brings you coffee, or the way you listen to your niece when she's scared, that is the gold. Caleb felt a lump in his throat. He thought about his own life and the people he had ignored because he was too busy being successful. He realized that the golden watch wasn't a prize for his achievements. It was a timer, reminding him that he still had time to start his first ripple. "The well is deep, Caleb," Elias said, turning back toward the cabin lights. "But the water is pure. Let's go inside. It's time for the final lesson." The advice to be integrated into the final hour. Do not seek to be known by many, seek to be a mercy to a few. A life that leaves behind a bit of knowledge, a tree that gives shade, or a heart that feels comforted by your memory is a life that has achieved total victory. You are a pebble in the hand of the Creator. trust where he drops you and let the ripples do the work. The final evening at the cabin felt different. The air wasn't heavy with questions anymore, it was light with understanding. Elias had prepared a simple meal, a vegetable stew and crusty bread. They sat at a small wooden table that had been scarred by years of use. Caleb noticed an empty chair at the table. It wasn't pushed in, it was angled toward the fire, as if waiting for someone who had just stepped out for a moment. Elias, Caleb said softly, I've been here for days and I've realized you live here all alone. Don't you ever get tired of the silence? Don't you ever feel like life is passing you by while you're tucked away in these woods? Elias tore a piece of bread, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. Caleb, I'm never alone, this chair, it's a reminder. Most people are alone even in a crowded room because they aren't actually there. Their bodies are in the room, but their minds are in next week or last year. I've learned that 1 hour of being fully present is worth a lifetime of being distracted. 010-035 The dialogue, the someday trap. Caleb looked at his own hands. I've spent my whole life waiting for the big moment. I thought that once I got the promotion, or once I paid off the house, or once I found the right person, then my life would start. I've been living in a waiting room. That is the great tragedy of the modern man, Elias said. We treat today like a bridge to get to tomorrow. We run across it so fast we never notice the view from the bridge. We think we are preparing for life, but life is what happens while we are making other plans. It's about the niyyah, the intention. If your intention is always on the destination, you'll never enjoy the walk. Let me tell you about Clara. Caleb looked at his own hands. I've spent my whole life waiting for the big moment. I thought that once I got the promotion, or once I paid off the house, or once I found the right person, then my life would start. I've been living in a waiting room. That is the great tragedy of the modern man, Elias said. We treat today like a bridge to get to tomorrow. We run across it so fast we never notice the view from the bridge. We think we are preparing for life, but life is what happens while we are making other plans. It's about the niyyah, the intention. If your intention is always on the destination, you'll never enjoy the walk. Let me tell you about Clara. 035-055 The story of Clara, the waiting room of life. Clara was a woman I knew back in the city years ago, Elias began. She was the most organized person you'd ever meet. She had a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and a retirement plan. When she was 20, she said, I'll be happy once I graduate. When she graduated, she said, I'll be happy once I'm married. When she got married, she said, I'll be happy once the kids are grown and out of the house. She spent her whole life looking over the horizon. She had a beautiful garden, but she never sat in it because she was too busy weeding it for a garden party she was going to have someday. She had a piano she never played because she was waiting until she had enough time to take professional lessons. One day, Clara turned 80. She sat in her quiet house looking at her planners and her calendars. She realized she had achieved everything on her list. She had the degree, the husband, the successful kids, the retirement fund. But as she looked back, she couldn't remember the taste of the coffee she drank every morning. She couldn't remember the feeling of the sun on her face. She told me before she passed, Elias, I spent my whole life waiting for the music to start, only to realize I was the one holding the violin the entire time. The concert was happening every single day, and I was the only one who didn't play. Elias leaned across the table. Don't be Clara, Caleb. Don't wait for a big moment to justify your existence. The fact that you woke up today, that you can breathe, that you can see the stars, that is the big moment. Every cup of tea, every conversation, every breath is a gift from the Creator. If you aren't present for the small gifts, you won't know how to handle the big ones. The watch in your pocket, it's not broken. It's just waiting for you to realize that now is the only time that actually exists. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the golden watch. He looked at the frozen hands. He didn't feel frustrated anymore. He felt a strange sense of peace. He realized that for the last 9 hours he hadn't thought about his emails once. He had been here. The advice to be integrated into the final hour. Your life is not a dress rehearsal for a future performance. This is it. The way you speak to your family tonight, the way you perform your work tomorrow, the way you carry yourself in the silence, this is the masterpiece. Set your intention, niyyah, to be a servant of the present moment. When you live in the now, you live in the presence of the divine. The story concludes back in Caleb's high-rise apartment. The city is buzzing, but he is still. He realizes that the golden pocket watch was never broken. It was a spirit-driven timepiece. In the final scene, Caleb stops trying to manage his time and starts honoring his time. He realizes that his father and grandfather didn't leave him a piece of jewelry, they left him a mirror. When he stops rushing, when he helps the woman on the highway, and when he finally breathes with gratitude, the watch begins to tick. The ticking isn't a countdown to a deadline, It's the heartbeat of a man who is finally alive in the present moment. The story ends with Caleb looking out at the city lights, not as a man who owns the world, but as a man who is finally part of it. The grand moral, the geometry of a good life. The core lesson of the 10-hour saga is this. True success is not measured by what you accumulate, but by the peace you carry within the storm and the mercy you leave in your wake. It breaks down into 3 pillars. Trust Tawakkul, you cannot control the wind, but you can always drop the anchor. Stress comes from trying to do God's job, peace comes from doing yours. Service, sadaka, a life spent only on oneself, is a closed loop that eventually runs dry. A life spent serving others is a river that is constantly replenished by the source. Presence, niyya, life is not happening over there at the finish line. It is happening in the weight of the hammer, the taste of the bread, and the silence of the forest. If you aren't here for the small moments, you will be absent for your own life. If you have listened to these 10 hours, you have given me the most precious thing you own, your time. My final advice to you is to take the watch out of your own pocket. Stop waiting for someday to be happy. Stop waiting for success to be kind. The loom is weaving, the well is waiting for your pebble, and the master weaver is watching the pattern. Go out into the world and be a mother tree for someone in the shade. That is how you make your own watch tick.